We're actually, in order to provide the context for what we are reading, I get there myself. There we go. The text that we're going to be looking at this morning initially is verses 1 through 3. But it helps if we go back a little bit in the context and look at verses 16 and through to 18 as well before we start reading that. It says, "Moreover, I saw under the sun in the place of judgment wickedness was there, and in the place of righteousness iniquity was there. I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every purpose and for every work. I said in my heart concerning the condition of the sons of men, God tests them that they may see that they themselves are like animals." And then we will go to verses 1 through 3 of chapter 4. "Then I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun. And look, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors there is power, but they have no comforter. Therefore I praise the dead who are already dead, more than the living who are still alive. Yet better than both is he who has never existed, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun." So, I had mentioned at the conclusion of last week that the nature of the book, or the tone of the book, shifts, starting in this section and through to about the conclusion. Solomon introduced his ideas, his high-level ideas, and sort of, I guess you would say, the thesis of his book in the first couple of chapters. And he concludes that roughly around verse 15. Now he goes at chapter 3. Now we will see that he there's sections that will begin now very similar to what we saw in verse 1. "Then I returned and considered." Verse 7 of chapter 4. "Then I returned and saw vanity. There is an evil," chapter 6, verse 1, "which I have seen under the sun and is common among men." So he describes unique situations. Now they have some commonalities, which we will identify as we go through, but generally speaking now, what he's doing is he's observing different things in life and making observations about them. And a lot of times we need to apply the things that he's already said, that there's a time and a place for everything, or oftentimes he will include that something is vanity. Sometimes he will include that things are good, even though ultimately everything is still vanity. That's the style of the writing up until the point where he draws a conclusion about everything, starting at about the middle of chapter 11. Chapter 12 is where we think the conclusion is. It actually sort of begins concluding the book at about the middle of chapter 11. Well, in typical Solomon fashion, he does not pull any punches. He begins with one of the worst case scenarios that one can see. Now, if we look today at our political system around the world, and we think of all the different countries, and we look at the legal systems, and we look at the world leaders, and we look at even in those countries where is considered generally fair and impartial, we still see our politicians up to no good. Our generation is not unique in the sense that we can look and see in the place of judgment, wickedness was there, and in the place of righteousness, iniquity is there. That is an observation that Solomon made in his time, of the kings that were around him. That is an observation that we can make today. In the worst case scenario of the wicked being in the place of judgment, you get the scenario he describes in chapter 4, verse 1 and 3. The tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors there is power. This is what is called systemic oppression. In other words, the very nature of the system, the legal system is designed to enforce and perpetuate the power of the one that has power, both from a legal perspective. Oftentimes, the oppressor is the judge, jury, and executioner. And the system is designed to keep him or her in power, and it's designed to always favor him and her, both politically, monetarily. And oftentimes, the oppression is exploitative. I'm going to use all of the legal resources at my disposal to make sure I get as much out of you and you get as little out of me as possible. This is not the intent of government that God set up. And yet, we see that there are countless governments that are arranged like this in Solomon's day and in Solomon's time. It can get so bad to live under a system like that. And you think of places like North Korea, for example, where people suffer under the rule of Kim Jong-un, before him, his father Kim Jong-il, and others. It can get so bad that Solomon says that it's better if those people had never been born. He says, he starts off by praising the ones that are already dead. Now, why does he praise them? Well, they can't suffer anymore, the indignities. But he's saying that actually it would have been better if they had never been born, because then they would have never had to have suffered those indignities to begin with. Now, I said that there's some things in Ecclesiastes that sometimes, because we want to say, oh no, life could never get that bad, there's always hope. Solomon surely has to be exaggerating. Solomon surely has to not really mean what he says. It's just a sense of in the moment. I would argue that Solomon means exactly what he says. And what can we learn from that? That when he says that it's better that those people had never existed than lived under that system. Now, I want us to keep a major point in mind. Solomon is writing during Old Testament times. There are times in this book where I said there's many, many applications that we can make to our own circumstances today. We also have to remember when we're going through Ecclesiastes that this is an Old Testament book, and that at the time that Solomon wrote, even though there was some characters in the some people in the Old Testament that we read about, like Abraham, who in Hebrews we know by faith he looked for a better city, a heavenly city. We know at that point in time that Abraham had an idea. We suspect that David had an idea of heaven because at the death of his son that was born as a result of his adulterous relationship with Bathsheba, that son died. After his mourning, David said that he eventually would see that son again. Now, that is an idea, an indication of an afterlife. That is an indication of, I believe, heaven. That some people in the Old Testament had a concept, but generally speaking, most people would have lived under a covenant in the Old Testament that is almost entirely physically based. Its rewards and its punishments are physically based, and it is a largely physically based covenant. We don't get our full concept and idea of heaven and what it's like until Jesus and the apostles start talking about heaven and the Spirit reveals about heaven to us. So for a lot of people in Old Testament times, life is life. And when we look at it from that perspective, if that is what you get out of life, then it is, from that perspective, from the physical perspective of not having the hope of heaven and the hope of Christ, better that you had never been born, if that was your perspective. So keep that in mind when we're looking at this. Now, can life get that bad? I want us to look at a few individuals. We're not going to go through all the texts and examples of them. Williams referenced it a couple of times just in recent sermons about Job's circumstance. everything. Job doesn't say anything at all for a week. He got his mouth zipped. And he then, in chapter 3, gives this speech about saying that he wished he had never been born. He gives this speech saying, you know, let that day when it was said a male child is born, let that day be blotted out. Let it be that it never even happened or existed. And Job had lost everything, and he wished that his life was ended at that point in time. Moses got so overwhelmed with the work and his frustration with the people of Israel that he pleaded with God to kill him. So did Ezekiel. Now keep in mind that he had just been driven out, and even though he had come off a high, sorry, I said Ezekiel. I meant to actually put Elijah, not Ezekiel, in my notes there. It says Ezekiel. I meant Elijah. I'll correct. I'll get a pen off someone later. I'll correct that. 700 prophets had been killed by Jezebel and Ahab. Yes, he came off a high from the contest where God's power was shown to be over Baal, but the fact was, he said, they've torn down, they've killed the prophets, and I alone am left. Elijah thought that he was the only faithful servant of God left. It was overwhelming to him, and he pleaded that God take his life. Even Jonah pleaded with God to take his life when Nineveh repented. Now, it shows us how dire the circumstances can be. None of these individuals, Job, we read about that there is none like him with his faith on the earth. Elijah, we know that he was a faithful servant of God. Moses was a faithful servant of God. And these three men are all pleading. Jonah, I put in the list, him pleading. I don't believe that Jonah's a plea with God. We can sometimes be dismissive of Jonah, but we have to remember, God chose him for a task. God chose him, and he knew that he was capable of doing it. We can often look at Jonah and be, he's frivolous. First he runs away, and then he goes ahead, and when he does preach, he doesn't like the result of his preaching. God doesn't choose people for a task that are incapable of doing that task. God is not going to choose an unrighteous man to do that task of preaching to an entire nation to get them to repent. Jonah was a righteous man. He made some big mistakes in that book. Jonah just didn't like, because he understood what God was doing, and he didn't like what God was doing. Jonah misunderstood God's mercy, that it was extended. The intent was to extend it to more than just Israel, but also to the other nations of the world as well. He's not the first person in history to misunderstand God's mercy, and he certainly won't be the last person in history to misunderstand God's mercy. All of these people wished that their life was over. Now, I want us to keep in mind something else when we're looking at this, and that is we have a luxury of living in Canada, of never in our lifetime having seen war on our soil. We've never had an invading army roll in with tanks. Those pictures that we see of Paris in World War II, those pictures that we see of Aleppo in Syria today, if you compare the two of them, they look almost identical. All you see is the shells of buildings left over because the places have been bombed. We've never experienced that in our lifetime. We've never been sleeping in the middle of the night and had agents of the government come in and take us or take family members. We've never experienced torture, physical torture, nor do I believe any of our family members have. We've never been subjected to what's known in the Constitution of the United States in Article 4 as unlawful search and seizure, where any government agent can basically come in at any time and rifle through your possessions looking for whatever they want. We've never had a lack of legal representation because the system doesn't recognize due process. That is, that we have the presumption of innocence, and we have the right to face our accusers, and we have the right to represent ourselves in our own defense. That concept in some countries is laughable or it's misapplied, that due process exists for the wealthy or for those in power, and from everyone else, it's a presumption of guilt. We haven't had restrictions placed on our movement, when we can leave the country, when we can go, who we can associate with, what jobs we can and cannot hold, simply because of our ethnicity or our religious beliefs. So the association, for example, there's some groups that have had it where, in our own country at times, where if more than a certain number of individuals were gathered at a time, that was illegal. 3 of X, whatever X is. Nope. Unless there's some special permit issued, you can't have 3 of those type of people gathered at the same time, or that's considered illegal. None of us have had to suffer that. Sadly, that is the daily state of affairs for some. That is the level of oppression that Solomon is talking about, that people are enduring, that it was better for them never to have been born because their life is so difficult. Now, again, I say we have the hope of heaven and the hope of Christ. We can comfort ourselves in that somewhat. What is the lesson for us to learn from this? Let's turn to 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 12. Oh, another verse where I'm not having a good. Oh, sorry, verse 2. Right, yes. I misquoted it myself. Starting in verse 1, therefore I exhort, first of all, this is Paul's instructions to Timothy and the churches that he goes to make sure these things are taught. Supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings and all who are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence. For this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all men to be saved to the knowledge of the truth. This verse, I think in our modern times, I'm going to posit that this is one of the things that most of us, I think, is near the bottom of our prayer list and might be treated like it's on there and it's one of the things that we should pray for, so I'm going to pray for it. But keep in mind, in Paul's time, that Christians were living under a government that at times could approach the level of what Solomon was talking about in its persecution of Christians. It depends on what emperor was in power and the circumstances. Certain emperors, like Diocletian in the 3rd century, Nero in the middle of the 1st century, and who was the one at the end? It also started with a D, the end of the 1st century. Another one of the emperors as well was particularly noted for his oppression of Christianity. We should be praying for the kings and for those that are in authority today, even in countries like Canada, so that it doesn't get to this point. We want the gospel to be spread freely, but I think our love for our fellow man should motivate us to make sure that we are praying for those that are in authority, that such systems would cease to exist, that people would not be suffering, and that we would be able to spread the gospel more readily. Solomon's statement is a reminder to us that in the absence of us preaching the gospel to those that are in power and to leading a godly life and pushing for these things and praying for these things, that oftentimes the situation we've just read about in chapter 4 will be what it degenerates into. We want to prevent that from happening. We should take God's command seriously in 1 Timothy chapter 2. In extent, we said, though I don't believe that chapter 4, verse 1 to 3 is included in that, where it said that there is a certain amount of injustice, I guess, that is permitted, but not condoned, that concerning the conditions of the sons of men, God tests them, that they see that they themselves are like animals. But the time and the place for wickedness is never stated. in chapter 3, verse 1 to 8. I don't know if you noticed that when we were going through that list, that not all circumstances in life were necessarily the most enjoyable that Solomon lists. A time to mourn, a time to weep, a time to die, a time to lose or throw away, a time of hate, that is to say conflict, aren't necessarily the most enjoyable circumstances. No time did Solomon say that there was a time to be righteous and a time to be wicked, or there is a time to do good and a time to sin. That is outside God's general purpose of life. Sin is always and has always been an aberration outside of God's plan. And it produces ultimately, when it's introduced into government and runs rampant, the situation that we read about in chapter 4, verse 1 to 3. There is a time, though, in which the judgment of the wicked will take place. Chapter 3, verse 17, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every purpose and for every work. Solomon is talking not about the eternal judgment there. He is talking about temporal judgment of the wicked in that case. We know as well, though, that there was in the Old Testament times both temporal judgments and there is an eternal judgment. Those systems of government that are oppressive will end at some point in time. And we can comfort ourselves with that, which is something that they could not, that is something that we have it as an advantage over those living in the Old Testament times. So the rest of the texts that we're looking at today aren't quite as heavy as what Solomon just talked about. And we'll go through these life scenarios. So let's go to chapter 4, verse 4 to 6. Again, I saw that for all toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. Better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. So Solomon turns for a little while to work now and relationships. He will come back in next week's lesson, Lord willing. We will come back to the wicked and those that are in power. But for now, he turns his attention to work. He contrasts, there's three classes of people that he's talking about here. The first is the one that works really hard. He could be, or he or she could be the self-made man. He could be the rags to riches person. He could just be the one that's very diligent all of the time. But look what he's got as a result. He's envied by his neighbor. So this is vanity and grasping for the wind because it's producing largely the opposite effect of what is intended. One should be enjoying the fruits of their labor, and instead what he's earning from his neighbor is envy. Now, this can rob the person who's doing the earning of their enjoyment of all they've worked for if he or she lets those other people rob them of that enjoyment. First of all, let's identify from Exodus chapter 20 and verse 17 that covetousness is listed, covetousness, envy is listed as a sin. And there's a list that Moses had given, not just of coveting a wife. Well, let's just go there. Exodus chapter verse 17. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything. Just in case they thought, that leaves me open to envy, I don't know, his water bucket or something, nor anything that is your neighbor's. So envy, which is what covetousness is, the two are quite heavily linked, is listed as a sin. This person has earned what they've worked for. There's no doubt about that. Now, Solomon doesn't say specifically that the one that's doing the envying is a fool. He doesn't say this. Again, I saw that for all the toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his foolish neighbors. But I don't think it's a coincidence that the next person that he mentions in verse 5 is the fool. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. We've looked at Proverbs before, and Proverbs has a lot to say about the fool and the wise. One of the characteristics of the fool, there's a few of the characteristics that we're going to encounter in our text today. One of the characteristics is that the fool consistently has a poor work ethic. Because the fool has a poor work ethic, he can't appreciate how much somebody puts effort they put in to actually earning something. That how much it takes to actually save up enough money to buy something and to have it as their own. Because the fool can't make that connection, they often look at their neighbors and think, they just had that handed to them. They just lucked out. It was fortunate, or they inherited, or it's not fair. How did they get a nice house and I've got this shack that's crumbling apart? The fool can't see that their own lack of work ethic has led to their having next to nothing, and this other person with a great work ethic has a whole bunch. But there's a third category of people that Solomon puts in here, and he says, better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. There's a third category of person, and that is a person that he doesn't necessarily have a lot. He's not a fool. He's worked for what he's got. But he hasn't worked to the point where work is the all-consuming purpose in his life. He's not got both hands together with toil, but he's also not the fool who's empty-handed and grasping for the wind. This, I would say, is the honest worker. This is a contentedness, is the place where an honest work ethic and contentedness with what we have so that we can actually enjoy our life and what's in it is the place where largely we want to be. If we turn to Luke chapter 3, we see this is exactly what John preaches to the people of his day, and it shows how much of a problem it was that he says almost the exact same thing to all three groups that come to him. Luke chapter 3 and verse 11. Let's just say, so the people come to him and says, what shall we do then? They want to avoid being in the category of people that are going to be judged that he talked about in the preceding verses. He answered and said to them, he who has 2 tunics, let him give to him who has none, and he who has food, let him do likewise. You have enough for yourself. You have the one tunic. Give the other tunic to somebody who doesn't have a tunic. Then tax collectors also came to be baptized and said to him, teacher, what shall we do? And the Pharisees were probably sitting there going, there's nothing you can do. But John doesn't say that to them. He says, collect no more than what is appointed to you. And likewise to the soldiers, he said, do not intimidate anyone or accuse falsely, and be content with your wages. Did you see the middle ground in each case that John is talking about? Being content with what we had. An honest living. Not the toiling and the working nonstop, not the foolishness that the fool has, but better a handful of quietness. We're going to see that a lot in this book, that oftentimes the best path is between two extremes in life. Just as in when we're looking at something, oftentimes we will see the truth sitting in between two extreme positions. In life, we see that sometimes the best path is the one that is in the middle. And this is one of those cases. So thinking of the workaholic, here's a picture of one in verse 7 and 8. He said, then I returned and saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone, without companion. He has neither son nor brother, yet to all his labors. Nor is his eye satisfied with riches. But he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity and a grave misfortune. This is the person that's working for work's sake. Any spare time that they have, is going towards work. But there's something wrong with this picture. First of all, he's never satisfied with the fruit of his labor. He's not satisfied with riches. So there's this constant energy being expended to satisfy a need that can never be satisfied. And on top of that, he's got nobody, he or she has nobody to share it with. Work is always the means to an end and not the end itself. And that's what this person has forgotten. That oftentimes we work so that we can get certain things, whether that be food, whether that be shelter, whether that be something that we have our eyes on. But just working for work's sake is like spinning your wheels on your tire. You drive to get somewhere. You don't drive just so that the wheels turn. That's what this person is doing. They're doing the equivalent of just driving a car just so the wheels can turn. Well, that's useless. You drive a car to get somewhere. This one has no companion. This one has no one to leave anything to or share with. So largely their effort is wasted. Vanity and a grave misfortune, even if they have amassed a huge amount of personal wealth, it's vanity. And Solomon says a grave misfortune. I think evil task literally is what that means. But I think Solomon is looking at this going, this is pitiable. This is just sad, is what he's saying, to be that person. So in the relationships, where we want to be are the people in verse 9 through 12. Two are better than one because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, two can withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. So who is the person in the preceding text working for? They weren't working for anybody. We do have more meaning when we can share that, but we have also more than just the benefit of sharing. We have the benefit of largely protection. So work, life, can be overwhelming at times. We can be injured, our health can fail, we can go through difficult circumstances. Having a companion, and I do believe that Solomon definitely has the marriage relationship in mind here with a husband and wife, but could also be close friends or brothers. The point is that we have individuals who, when one goes through difficult circumstances, the other can help see them through it. We think of the couple where one of them has lost a job, that while the one is looking for the other, maybe the other person's income can help see them through that difficult time. Or somebody is going through difficult health circumstances and they have somebody to help take them to their appointments, make sure that they've got the medication, maybe help them to and from getting around the house, making sure that they've got food and things like that. That's very difficult for a person to do when they're alone. One of them can help the other out. And it's not always necessarily the one person always helping the other person out. The circumstances can sometimes switch. The person that needed help the one time might be the person that's helping the other the next time. There's an advantage, and it's bigger than the sum of its parts. What I mean by that is the advantage that both of them get isn't just the amount that they would have gotten together individually added together. It's more than that. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. Solomon does not specifically mention God in this text, and yet I think that in any relationship, we'll take the marriage relationship, for example, that if a couple has faith in the Lord, when difficult circumstances arise, they can rely on each other, but they can also rely on the Lord. And their faith can help see them through difficult circumstances. Certainly, I think that is that Solomon we can do justice to the text and take that interpretation. It could also mean close friends, other family members, anything that's supporting, that's supportive, that makes it so that there's a third chord there, is going to do justice to the text. Let's go and turn to verse 13 to verse 16. We're not going to spend a whole bunch of time on this text because I want us to get to chapter 5, verse 1 to 7, which is a very, has a lot of lessons for us. This sort of finishes off Solomon's thoughts on work life. Better a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who will be admonished no more. For he comes out of prison to be king. Although he was born poor in his kingdom, I saw all the living who walk under the sun. They were with the second youth who stands in his place. There was no end of all the people over whom he was made king. Yet those who come afterward will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and grasping for the wind. So if I just read that text and you thought, what is Solomon talking about? I have no idea. You're not alone. This is a difficult portion of Ecclesiastes, and there are a lot of different views on what exactly Solomon is talking about here. I think, though, the key from the context that we see about Solomon talking about work and relationships, let's look at the two individuals, and I think that will help us understand what Solomon's talking about. We've got two people here. We've got a poor and wise youth, and we've got an old and foolish king. Now let's look at the advantages and disadvantages. Let's start with the king. What's the advantage that he has? Well, he's king, so he's got power, and he's got the trappings of royalty. But he's got three strikes against him. He's old, and he won't be admonished anymore. He doesn't take advice, he doesn't listen, he doesn't want to change his ways. That really is the nature of his foolishness, but Solomon lists them as three disadvantages. What about the youth? What are his circumstances? Well, his disadvantage is that, and it's stated right there, he's poor, unknown and obscure. I would say that his youth is both an advantage and a disadvantage. Advantage in the sense that he doesn't have experience. He doesn't have life experience, so that's a disadvantage. But he has opportunity. The old foolish king, he doesn't have opportunity anymore. He's wasted all of his opportunities, and he's not willing to change, so he can't improve his circumstances. He's stuck where he's at. The youth, though, has the opportunity to change, and he's listed as wise. That's his biggest advantage. So on the surface, if we were to look at these two people, and we don't know what their end result is, on the surface it might be like, who would you rather be? Oh, I'd rather be the king. He's got all of this power. He's got all of these things. Okay, he might have that, but look where the two of them end up. The poor but wise youth ends up in the position of the king. He ends up having his circumstances changed. What's Solomon's point then? I believe Solomon's point is we can start in very different circumstances in life. We can start with be dealt a bad hand, so to speak. Whereas another person can have the proverbial born with the silver spoon in their mouth and have everything handed to them. We can end up almost reversed by the end of it. Because if we don't have wisdom, and we don't have opportunity, and we don't have the wisdom to take advantage of those opportunities, we can quickly squander what advantage we have and lose it. So the poor and wise youth, it's better to be him because he doesn't end being the poor and wise youth. But just to remind us that we're reading Ecclesiastes, Solomon points in that both of them end up in ultimately the same circumstance with nobody remembering them. And surely this also is vanity and grasping for the wind. Just in case we forgot, that regardless, they both end up in the same place. Now, here's a section that we're looking at this morning that I think has the most application for us from a spiritual perspective. We can take encouragement from a physical perspective from the other ones. Chapter 5, verse 1 through 7. Walk prudently when you go to the house of God, and draw near to hear, rather than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they do evil. Do not be rash with your mouth, and let not your heart utter anything hastily before God. For God is in heaven and you on earth, therefore let your words be few. For a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. Do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? Dreams and many words, there is also vanity, but fear God. The Bible has many things to say about speech. Just like in Proverbs, there is as many verses on Proverbs about speech, all the good that it can do and all the trouble that it can get us into, as there is on work ethic. Solomon has a specific form of speech in mind. A lot of times the Proverbs, they're talking about our speech to one another. This section is dealing with our speech before God. The lesson is be careful, mindful, and considerate of what we say to God. Characteristic, well, not the biggest, but one of the major characteristics of a fool. So much so that Solomon actually says even a fool can be considered wise before he opens his mouth and speaks. You can't really, from the surface, if you had two men just standing there just like this, and they were identically dressed and everything like that, and maybe they looked quite similar, and you said, which one's the fool and which one's the wise? You looked at them. It'd be hard to tell the difference. Then they start talking, and you'll probably be able to figure out who the fool is pretty quick. That is because speech, and known by as many words, prattle on and on and on and on. Not just many words, but hasty words. Words where the person hasn't put thought into what they're saying are the characteristics of a fool. Solomon is saying, don't be that person, and especially don't be that person in front of the Lord. Now, he has specifically, I believe, the public assembly in mind, but the application can easily be made to private prayer as well. And this sacrifice of fools that Solomon is talking about in verse 1 is not metaphorical. Turn to Leviticus chapter 4, I believe. Yes, Leviticus chapter 4. Oh, 5, right, there we go. Leviticus chapter 5, verse 4 to 6. Or if a person swears speaking thoughtlessly with his lips to do evil or to do good, whatever it is that a man may pronounce by an oath, and he is unaware of it, when he realizes it, then he shall be guilty in any of these matters. And it shall be when he is guilty in any of these matters that he shall confess that he has sinned in that thing, and he shall bring his trespass offering to the Lord for his sin which he has committed, a female from the flock, a lamb or a kid of the goats as a sin offering. So the priest shall make atonement for him concerning his sin. This is interesting. When I first read this, I thought, how could a person not know that they've sworn something? I mean, it's fairly obvious, isn't it? The only thing I could think of was we see times when people get, in the Old Testament, overwhelmed by their emotions. David was so angry about Nabal's snubbing him that he was ready to march there and kill the man, and I suspect kill more than just Nabal. That's how enraged he was. Fortunately, he was talked out of it. Saul was so worked up that he went ahead and made the hasty oath that almost cost him his army and almost cost him his own son's life. And he made these out. People talk when they get really angry or really worked up, and things just fly out of their mouth, and they don't even realize sometimes what they're saying. But if they've made an oath, they have to back out of it. They have to make a sacrifice. It was sinful for them to have done that. They need to repent of that. To avoid that, Solomon says, is keep it zipped up, be careful what you're saying in front of the Lord, and go with the intent to hear. See that? Walk prudently when you go to the house of God. Draw near to hear rather than to give the sacrifice of fools. If we go with the intent to the public assembly, whether we were living under the Old Testament or whether now, to be like, I am going to encourage others, I am going to, with the intent of listening to the Bible study class and the sermon and pay attention to what's said seriously, the odds of us end up doing one of these goes substantially down. James says the same thing. Be swift to hear and slow to speak. So many of the problems that we have in life could be avoided if, rather than saying, I wish that person would stop talking so I can get a word in edgewise, if we would just hear what that person was trying to tell us, we probably would have avoided saying rash things. Same thing with God. How to avoid saying these rash things to God? I think a general rule of thumb, if we have trouble with this, is pretend a head of state is in the room, some important person, or pretend that you work for a company and the CEO of the company is there, or the owner of the company that you work for is in the room with you. Now, you're going to be much more careful about what you say. At work, as you know, I have a sense of humor. I don't lose that sense of humor when I'm around my coworkers. I don't joke around casually when I'm in the room with my director. That's not to say that she doesn't have a sense of humor and I've lost my sense of humor. It's just that I recognize that there's a time and place for everything, and that the person is very busy, that there's a seriousness about the task that we're at, and I modify my speech appropriately. And I am aware of the fact that sometimes if you're joking around, you can make comments that sometimes may borderline on something. You don't want to make that type of comment in front of a director, someone who can influence where your career may go at some point in time. Well, you don't want to make that comment in front of a head of state or something like that. God is greater than the CEO of a company or a head of state. We must remember when we approach him in prayer. We have a privilege in the New Testament to be able to approach God in prayer through Christ to a much greater degree than we do. We have a level of access to God in the New Testament that they didn't have in the Old Testament. That does not mean that the relationship that we have with God in our speech has become casual. We still need to remember who it is we're talking to. Just to remind us, he says, do not be rash with your mouth, nor let your heart utter anything hastily before God, for God is in heaven and you on earth. There's that reminder of that differential between us. The multitude of speech can be there. The multitude of dreams. Fools can be carried away by dreams. Dreams are important. Plans, I think as we talked about, plans are important to have, but we need to recognize that sometimes they are just ideas that we have. They're not necessarily reality. The fool gets carried away sometimes with his ideas. They're not grounded in reality. That is what Solomon is largely admonishing us to do in this section, is to be careful what we say when we are talking to God. Consider our words carefully. And I think that is the one that has, of the text that we've looked at today, probably has the most direct application to us for day-to-day occurrences and day-to-day things.